Hi, it's Chico. Today I want to take you behind the scenes and into my design process and take you inside to what I'm actually thinking about when I'm doing design. So I want to show you how I went from this logo to this logo. So this is what the client came to me with. This is what they had done already. And it's not a bad foundation. It's really clean. It feels a little modern. Um, in terms of design, there's some things that are happening here. So let's give this a quick little crit. What I would say first of all is to look at the negative space. Don't always look at um, the positive space because it's really hard to get lost in what's happening here, but lose what's happening around and in between all your space. So, negative space is very important when you're doing design. So, right here, what's happening is now we've created a frame, or he's created a frame here around his text. So, as a designer, I'd want this to be really clean right here. Like we almost have a justification of this D lining up here with the S and the V, and we almost have this here. You can also see that the space here is a little smaller than the space here. So, I mean, I'd really want this D to be here at the edge, and I'd really want this N to be here at the edge, so that everything's justified and we're really squaring off the square. Now, second, you could see when I start to square off this space here that we have a really wide gap here and we have a really thin gap here. So you really want to be conscious of your negative space. I would really close this up so that this gap is the same size as this gap, and you have the same size here as the same size here. So you're really looking at the negative space around. So then let's look at the negative space in between. So now we have all these weird shapes happening in here. And this can be really hard on the eye when you're trying to get something across very immediate and quickly, is what you want to do in a logo. And also, because we have this type just kind of stacked here, we have a really weird cramming that's happening here. So this tangency isn't really good. It's just starting to make this look messy. So we really don't want that to happen. If I was sticking with this logo, some things that I would do would be to one, look at the ascender height of all these letters. So you could see the T stops here and the D continues very high, the L continues very high. I'd probably bring all these ascenders down to the T height to start with. So I delete all that, I delete all that, I delete all that. Then I'd bring the spacing between this closer together so that this locks up as a block. The text locks up a little bit better. Then what I would do is figure out what is going on here, because this dot on this I is probably just going to have to go. So if I do that, that means what happens to the dot on this side? Does this go too? So that's something that you're going to have to start to look at when you get into using this lowercase. When you're trying to do something really clean and geometric with lowercase, you start to have these kind of issues with the negative space. So now let's talk about how I got from here to here. So here's what the client had. And so now what I'm looking at is some information, not just the visual part of the design, the decorative part, but now the informational part of the design, which is Versola Design Studios. I mean, these days there's so many designers and studios out there. I'm one of them. That we really have to look at what differentiates us. So what is the differentiator here? It's not really design studios. That's more a subtext. His differentiator here is really his name. So I want to focus on his name. Well, immediately when I write out the name, I can see a relationship between the V and the A. I know that there's a V here and an A here. So as you start to evolve that as a designer, you want to start evolve that visual language. And so you can see here I have a V, I have an A that mirrors it, mimics it. You can start to create a pattern out of that. You can start to do lots of things with this. So now I kept a similar font, really clean. I set the type here to be Versola. I have the V mirroring the A on the end. I made the box width a little bit wider than the stroke width of the letters. so that this really holds these letters in here. But it's just very subtle. Like you don't want to be, it's very fine line that you want to find between those weight balances. Now, something that happens here because of these letters is the L and the A, I normally would have to bring closer and make a ligature. A ligature is when two letters form. So you have an L and an A. Well, because they make a big space here, often one solution is to bring letters like this together so that they join and then the space becomes less. And then it seems like it's kerned better with the spacing between all of these letters. Well, fortunately, in this case, the V also, when lined up with this E, gives us a big space here. We have a big space here. The problem was when I started opening up the spacing between here, it just got too open. It started to fall apart, which I didn't want. So in this case, I just kind of went with it and let the V and the A do their things because they still visually kind of frame this because this locks up as a little block here and then the V and the A are on the end. So if you spin this around, it would mirror itself in a way. Now, Design Studios down here is now our subtext. So another thing that I'm looking at here is all this spacing. So you could see that the V and the D are lined up, the A and the S are lined up here. So this just makes the I easier to move through the logo. Another thing is the spacing. So usually some things you'll find if you look at my logos is I create relationships between the objects. So this space here, I don't remember, but it's probably pretty much equivalent to this space. So that's how I arrive at getting to this space. I often find measurements between things that I create my own relationships that I don't really talk about much, but that's how I usually arrive at like how I get to certain spacing around my different forms in my logo when I'm coming up with a mark. Now, you have to think about when you have a logo, how is it going to translate to social media these days? And everything needs to work in a thumbnail. That means that this logo has to work super, super tiny. Basically, in the space of this O, I have to be able to fit this whole logo. Well, when I do that, I mean, you could see if I just draw this here, I'm going to have this tiny little chunk. Like, who's going to see that and be able to read that when you're scrolling through social media? So now we had to figure out, well, what does this logo do when it goes to social media? Well, what it does is it collapses and it becomes a different version of itself. And first we started going somewhere like this, but this is very common. You'll see there's like a brand, RVCA, that uses something like this. So we didn't want to do this exactly. We want to do something a little more original. So keeping in that mindset, we went here and started thinking about, well, we have a V and an A on the end of the word. Well, what's all this in the middle? If you remove, let's say you're writing in grammar and you have a contraction, you have an apostrophe. So that's where this shape came from. It's the idea of an apostrophe replacing all the letter forms in between. So that is how I arrived at this shape right here. So he has this VA, has this hyphen shape. It becomes very graphical. It could be used in a repeat pattern. It has a lot of potential here. So that's a little bit behind the design process and going from this logo to this logo and evolving it to work on social media.